Hello everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday video kindly sponsored by Skillshare. You've probably seen or heard of them before, but just in case you haven't, Skillshare is an online learning community which contains a wide variety of skill-improving classes that everyone can benefit from. If you want to learn a new skill, advance an existing one, or just see how other people happen to make things work, there'll be a video for you. For fellow naval enthusiasts, such as myself, there are topics like illustration, photography, film and video, and many others. So whether you want to draw ships, photograph ships, or make videos about ships, there are tips, tricks, and techniques to discover. To help when it comes to visiting museum ships and improve the quality of what you see on screen, I'm currently listening to a couple of videos, one on documentary filmmaking by Amy Vital, and another by Justin Bridges, which is helping me brush up on how my DSLR camera actually works and how I can make it work better for me. I also happen to like how other members can leave further notes on the videos. The first series, for example, has a helpful person pointing out that if you're operating near the sea, it's usually a good idea to wipe your camera down once you've gotten back home or to your hotel, which is quite relevant considering where most museum ships are based. There are no ads on the site, but there are new classes being added all the time. I'll be keeping an eye out for follow-ups to these two series, for example. Skillshare is currently less than $10 a month with an annual subscription, but if you want to give it a try first, the first 1,000 of you who click on the link in the description below will get free trials of premium membership so that you can take a look around and see what might take your interest. Thanks again to Skillshare, and now on with the video. So today, as I work on a rather extensive video for next week, we are going to return to the wonderful book Against the Odds, and this time we're going to look at the exploits of a particularly brave and particularly innovative set of sailors during the Second World War, and that is the Italian Frogmen. And no, this isn't some kind of strange genetic hybrid going on. These are the Italian underwater specialists who were pretty much the top of the class when it came to setting explosive charges underwater on ships where, ships really don't want to find underwater explosives. So, let's have a look at Chapter 23, Italians Underwater. We're going to be covering Italian actions in Malta and in Alexandria during 1941. Italian experiments in attacking enemy harbours by stealth and ingenious daring, rather than brute force backed by elaborate planning, dated back to the First World War. Various techniques, from swimmers towing explosive charges to motorboats with caterpillar tracks to enable them to climb over defensive obstacles, were thought up and experimented with. Their most spectacular success was in sinking the Austrian battleship Viribus Unitis at Pola in the Adriatic on the 1st of November 1918, 10 days before the armistice. The idea lay dormant until the run-up of tension leading to the Second World War, of which an early marker was Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, followed by the imposition of sanctions by the League of Nations, and a potential confrontation between the Italian Navy and the British Mediterranean Fleet based in Alexandria in Egypt, and the island of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the rock fortress of Gibraltar looking out over the Atlantic, was now a possibility. To the British, those bases were essential links in the spine of the empire. To the Italians, the island of Malta, with a partly Italian population and situated just south of Sicily, could now be looked on as a threat. The idea behind the creation of the special unit, given the cover name of 10th Light Flotilla, or La Decima Flottiglia MAS, was to strike vital blows at the British Navy in all its Mediterranean bases at the outset of the war, and so cripple it immediately. Such schemes almost never come to fruition because of too optimistic a vision on one side and excessive conservatism on the other, with financial considerations in the middle. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 is a notable exception, although the midget submarine assault, which was part of the Japanese plan, proved to be an almost total failure. The Italians did develop the necessary range of weapons and equipment, however. There were three basic types of vehicle, each of which would have to be transported most of the distance from any Italian base to within a few miles of the chosen target. The first was the explosive motorboat, capable of around 30 knots. This was piloted by one man and propelled by an outboard motor, which also steered it, and could be lifted so as to allow the boat to go over a boom defence. The boat was very lightly built and carried a 300-kilo explosive charge in the bow, which would detach on impact and sink toward the bottom, exploding by a pressure fuse. To avoid being killed by it, the pilot released a float, flung himself backwards off the speeding boat just before impact, and got onto the float. Needless to say, this required a somewhat brave individual. The biggest success achieved with this method of attack was in Suda Bay on the island of Crete, then a temporary British naval base. The heavy cruiser York and some merchant ships were sunk by this method. The second vehicle can be regarded either as an outsized torpedo or as a very small submarine, about 22 feet long, far too small to be piloted from the inside, even by children. The two-man crew actually rode on it, astride, one behind the other, on seats and behind a shield, as the drag was quite immense, and the Italians described them crudely as pigs, or of course they were speaking Italian, but I'm not very good at that. Of course, the pig pilots wore the new Frogmen type diving gear, lightweight suits, oxygen rebreathing sets which did not give off bubbles, but did have a severe depth restriction, and on occasion they would also wear fins or flippers. These two-man torpedoes could be carried to very near the target port by a conventional submarine, fitted with big canisters on the deck, which acted as hangars for the torpedoes. The third vehicle which could be employed was a conventional man in a suit, mask, swim fins, an oxygen rebreather, carrying or towing to the targets a small explosive charge. In British popular post-war parlance, these were called Frogmen. In similar British naval equipment, there was a depth limitation of 30 feet, but the Italians could, and did, go deeper, even in peacetime, where they were usually found hunting fish. As the oxygen was recirculated and breathed again, this type of set gave longer duration than the civilian-type aqua lung, which was available, which used compressed air. The three methods did not go well together, largely because of the different speeds that they averaged. 30-plus knots for the explosive motor boats, 3 knots for the piloted pigs, and perhaps 1 knot for the Frogmen. In many ways, the Mediterranean was ideal for the slow-speed underwater vehicles. The water was warm, there was little tide, and few currents. Visibility was usually like looking through champagne, which tended to work both ways as it did make submarines easily detectable from the air, even if they were down to 150 foot of depth. Italy entered the war on the 10th of June 1940, by which time the Germans, unaided, had beaten the Allies in Europe and expelled the last British forces from the continent. In that year, the 10th Light Flotilla attempted to attack Alexandria twice, and lost both the submarines transporting the pigs. In August, the Iride was sunk by a bomber, and in September, the Gondar was sunk by shipping. In October, Gibraltar was attacked by pigs, but without success. In March 1941, the explosive motorboats had their great victory in Suda Bay in Crete. In May, the pigs failed again at Gibraltar, and in July came the suicidal assault on Grand Harbour, Malta. Only after that were there impressive successes at Gibraltar and Alexandria. The assault on Malta involved a mixed unit using both fast explosive motorboats and the slower pigs. Malta had been more or less neutralised at this time by air power, and so the potential targets on offer were few, and it still remained a uniquely defensible fortress. In the 16th century it had defied a Turkish invasion force and afterwards had been further fortified. The Grand Harbour was covered by solid stone walls rising almost sheer above the water on both sides, with modern artillery instead of culverin and cannon, and the sea was watched by radar day and night. The failures at Gibraltar had resulted in the abandonment of both the divers' equipment and their small vessels, and it was feared that the British might have discovered these. The success at Suda Bay had of course revealed the method of the explosive motorboats, and had resulted in the capture of an intact example of them. Surprise, therefore, had been lost to a certain degree, since all the attacking methods were now potentially known by the British. A certain amount of frustration must have been felt by the Italians, who had begun with such grandiose plans and high hopes only to see them foiled, as they saw it, by a lack of vision by their own authorities. This, however, is almost the inevitable fate of pioneers. Contributing further to the final rash decision to attack Malta must have been the failure, for technical reasons due to the fundamentally frail means being employed, of successive attempts to approach the Grand Harbour, whilst an element of tragedy was undoubtedly the sentence of professional death passed by the unit's doctor on Major Tessio Tesse, one of the two co-inventors and pioneers of the unit, which had always regarded Malta as its prime objective. As a diver and pilot for one of the pigs, Tesse had recently been declared unfit for diving for 6 months owing to serious cardiac weakness. In spite of this, he made underwater inspections of the torpedoed battleship Conte de Cavour, but the medical verdict must have signalled to him the approaching end of the life that he loved. He campaigned to be used against Malta, and less than a week before the final attack wrote to a friend that he would shortly attain the highest of all honours, that of giving my life for the king and the honour of the flag. As you know, this is the supreme desire of a soldier and the most sublime joy. But he could not do this alone. As pilot of a pig, he had a companion, Petty Officer Pedretti. Pedretti was probably slightly less enthused by this rather pessimistic outlook. According to Prince J. Valiero Borghese, a submarine commander and leader of the underwater division of the 10th Light Flotilla, the only information the Italians had about Malta at this time was from aerial reconnaissance. For Italy in 1941, there was nothing much known for sure about the defences of the two main naval harbours which flanked the fortified town of Valletta, Grand Harbour on the one side and Maramuschetto on the other, where the smaller warships, such as destroyers and submarines, were berthed. It was planned to devote a pig to each of the harbours, to blow away through any boom. The headland between the two harbour entrances was crowned by Fort St. Elmo, which, as originally built, had for a month in May and June 1565 held off a vastly superior force of Ottoman Turks. The defending knights numbered many Frenchmen, Italians and Spaniards. The defence to the death, literally, of Fort St. Elmo is one of the classics of siege warfare. The knights seem to have been of like mind to Major Tesse, and in the same place, separated merely by some 4 centuries of time. It was assumed by the Italians in 1941 that the entrance to the Grand Harbour, at least, must be impassable. But the entrance, not too unlike that of Zeebrugge, was narrowed by a mole which was connected to the mainland at St. Elmo by a bridge. Tesse was to destroy the nets which blocked the passage under the bridge, which was normally used by very small craft only. Through this gap, once blown by Tesse's warhead, the small explosive motorboats would tear in at 30 knots to wreak havoc in the Grand Harbour and the creeks which led off of it. The commander of the 10th Light, Mokagata, led the attack in person. The old plan, which had so often proved troublesome, of towing the frail explosive boats had changed. A former destroyer, the Diana, was to carry them on board to within a short distance of Malta, and she would tow a special motorboat called an MTL, which would cast off and carry the pigs to their correct launch point. The pilots' heads being only just above the water, identifying the right landfall would be hard for them. One of Mokagata's senior officers, Lieutenant Commander Giobe, expressed uneasiness about the operation to Mokagata, who said he felt confident. The little fleet left Augusta in Sicily at sunset on the 25th of July. When the Diana was some 20 miles from Malta, she launched the 9 explosive boats which were to penetrate Grand Harbour. One sank immediately. The remaining 8 boats, marshalled by Giobe, set off in line ahead for Malta, escorted by 2 large rescue motorboats. The MTL, carrying the 2 pigs, was cast off and also headed to Malta. The Italian Air Force was supposed to fly diversionary attacks to cover the noise of the engines at sea. Giobe's feeling of unease was justified. The approach of the force showed on British radar, and the close-range defences were alert, with the efficiency of war-experienced men, mostly Maltese. Their weapons included machine guns, rapid-firing Bofors guns, and 6-pounders. No one was likely to loose off in a fit of fear or wild enthusiasm, and they would wait for the order to fire at close range. A single Italian aeroplane arrived over Malta at 2:45 in the morning on the 26th of July, and shortly afterwards the MTL launched the 2 pigs just off the Mole Bridge by St. Elmo. The man torpedo piloted by Costa had engine trouble, and time was lost while Tese tried to help him. As Costa left to make his approach to Musetto harbour, he remarked that they were now an hour late. Tese told him at 4:30 the net has to blow up, and it will blow up. If I am late, I shall fire the charge straight away. Giobe in his big rescue boat led the 8 explosive boats at dead slow speed to within sight of the bridge in the mole. And there they waited, their target silhouetted against the night sky. And the British waited too. At 4:20, 2 more Italian airplanes arrived, 10 minutes before the defences were to be breached. At 4:30, the thump of an underwater explosion was heard. And that was all. Giobe did not know, and was never to know, of that last conversation between Costa and Tese. In his mind must have been the thought that Tese might be underwater, retiring. Then he made up his mind. He gave orders to the explosive boats driven by Frassetto and Carabelli. If the net under the bridge was still intact, then they should blow a way through with their boats. The other 6 boats would wait on the result. The 2 attackers set off at a high speed in a sudden burst of spray with the bows rising out of the water. Frassetto bailed out 80 metres from the net hanging down under the bridge and climbed onto his escape raft, but heard no explosion. Behind him, Carabelli, roaring past, bound for the net. He did not bail out, but there was a roar as the explosive charge went off, and the bridge collapsed, blocking the way through far more effectively than any net. The British searchlights came on, brilliantly illuminating the remaining 6 boats as they sped toward the broken span of the bridge, their pilots not realising that their way in was blocked. And with the searchlight's glare came a hail of crossfire hammering away at the 6 frail targets, which were brought to a stop almost immediately. A few seconds were enough for all movement on the water to cease, ran a British report. The striking force was wiped out entirely. All the explosive boats were destroyed. Tese and Pedrette's pig was destroyed with its own charge. Costa was captured and his pig was lost. On their return, the supporting motorboats were attacked by Hurricane fighters, which encountered Italian Macchi fighters. 1 motorboat was sunk, 1 captured, and the MFL was also lost. 2 Macchis and 1 Hurricane were shot down, and the 10th Light had lost 15 men dead and 18 captured. In the water off Fort St Elmo, the British found the remains of a Frogman's breathing mask, with small bits of its occupant attached. Major Tese, who was determined to succeed at all costs, or Petty Officer Pedretti, who could only follow? No one would know. The naval surgeon who had reported Tese unfit for diving for 6 months was also among the dead, as were Mokagata and Giobe, the leaders. Only 11 Italians returned alive from the shattered assault force. In an abandoned motorboat captured by the British was somebody's lucky mascot, a white furry dog with a red bow. A British typist adopted him, and Bruno Bianco was her mascot from now on. One might have thought that such an outright disaster must have resulted in the disbandment of the remnants, but this was not so. The Italians persevered. In September 1941 they went back to Gibraltar a 3rd time, with the big warships in the inner harbour their priority target. But the British defenders were now alert to underwater attack. Still, the pigs sank 4 merchant ships, including some tankers. Total for a night's work by a handful of men riding cheap weapons, 30,000 tons of shipping sunk. In December, a prime target appeared, Britain's last remaining battleships in the Mediterranean. In November, German U-boats in the Mediterranean had sunk 2 important ships, the famous aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the old battleship Barham. That left only 2 battleships, both of the same class, the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, whereas the Italian battle fleet now numbered 5, 3 modernised ships of First World War vintage and 2 new and powerful units, the Vittorio Veneto and the Littorio. The only 2 ships which could oppose these 5, the modernised Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, were now safe behind elaborate defences in Alexandria harbour. 2 unsuccessful attempts had been made on Alexandria the previous year, in August and September 1940. This would be the 3rd. The nucleus of the small fleet required in 1940 was the small submarine Iade, or Iris, of around 600 tons, plus the motor torpedo boat Calypso to carry the pigs from the main base at La Spezia in northern Italy to an advanced base on the North African coast in the Gulf of Bomba just west of Tobruk, where a tanker and some other Italian vessels were anchored. This unusual concentration attracted the notice of British air reconnaissance. Also, the Italians had lingered there because the submarine had not been tested when carrying the pigs, and that test was to be carried out on the Libyan coast, which was on the enemy's doorstep. As the Erde was leaving for deeper water to carry out the test, 3 low-flying British aircraft appeared. The central one dropped a torpedo, and his companions flew down the side of the submarine machine-gunning before attacking the other targets present. The torpedo struck the bows of the Iride, which sank at once. Only 14 men came to the surface from where the wreck lay. All the underwater diving gear was in her, but the pilots of the pigs got down without breathing apparatus, as she lay in only 15 metres and secured a marker buoy. When new diving gear was brought from Tobruk, it was found that there were 9 men trapped alive in the aft part of the wreck, which had been blown in two, and their escape hatch had jammed. The divers then took 20 hours to clear the hatch. They found jammed under it the corpses of 2 petty officers who had tried to get out and failed. The remaining 7 men were cajoled to flood their compartment and then swim underwater, and in semi-darkness to the hatch, go through that small gap, and make for the surface of the sea some 30 feet above. Some had to be threatened before they would do it, but all 7 finally reached the surface, one with a great shout of relief at seeing the sun again, but 2 of the poor chaps, following their natural instincts, kept their mouths closed while underwater and did not breathe out on the ascent. As a result, they died. That was the end of the August attempt, but the Italians tried again the following month. 2 small, more modern submarines, the Gondar and Skire, were converted as underwater transports for the pigs, with hangars on deck to accommodate them, thus doing away with the necessity for a separate surface vessel. The Gondar was chosen for the second attempt in September 1940, but was ordered to turn back at the last minute because the British fleet had left Alexandria. On her return, the submarine was detected and depth charged for 12 hours. All tanks had to be blown in a last attempt to reach the surface and let the crew get out, where 2 British destroyers, a corvette, and a Sunderland flying boat were waiting for them. The third attempt on Alexandria did not occur until more than a year later, in December 1941, when success would be even more vital to the Axis powers. The Skire, under Prince J. Valerio Borghese, was chosen to transport the pigs, and much more careful training and planning preceded this attack. An interesting evaluation of the volunteers for this hazardous duty was employed. Personal motives were probed and personal circumstances examined. For instance, financial trouble was regarded as a valid reason for refusing a volunteer, as was being crossed in love or involvement in family quarrels. This was shrewd. While any of these events might act as spurs to gallant conduct in ordinary sailors and soldiers, an underwater operator requires above all to be calm and peaceful in his mind. Anything emotionally jarring is highly dangerous. Borghese had also stressed the ability to keep secrets, and not necessarily just the obvious ones, but of every detail concerned with the work. It is easier, he wrote, to get an Italian to lay down his life than to make the sacrifice of holding his tongue. He noted the compulsive urge amongst Italians to show that they are well informed and to boast. The prince does his countrymen something of an injustice. Many males of whatever nation, and not a few females also, feel this same urge for self-importance. It may be argued that for divers who operate alone, this feeling is a necessary ingredient for success. It is the open expression of it, which is dangerous in wartime. Secrecy was indeed vital to all these stealthy operations of the Italians, and it was the first test that all the volunteers had to pass. From already accepted and trained volunteers, an appeal was made in this case for those who would be prepared to take part in an important operation from which the chances of a return were problematic. Those accepted were requested to settle their affairs, as at best they could expect only imprisonment for an unknown period of years. 6 men from this group were chosen to man 3 pigs, with 1 reserve team. This time the advanced base was not on the coast of North Africa, where land battles were raging back and forth at great speed, but on the quiet Greek island of Leros in the Dodecanese group, then belonging to Italy. The coast of Turkey was not far away, and the British did have a secret harbour there, so vigilance could not be relaxed. The local naval commander came over from Rhodes, demanding that an exercise be laid on for him, which would of course have been noted by the Greeks and by them to the Allies, but Borghese had the authority to refuse, which he did. His own part was vital. He had to penetrate the minefields guarding Alexandria and make a night landfall on a low coast lacking in prominent landmarks. Really precise navigation would be required. On the night of the 18th of December, it was dark and calm, perfect conditions. The Skire arrived at exactly the right place after navigating blind. The 3 pigs were launched, and manned by Della Pen and Bianchi, Marghelia and Scergat, Martellota and Marino, they disappeared into the night. For the next 2 nights, the submarine Zafiro appeared and was to lie 10 miles off Rosetta in the Nile Delta in case any of the pilots managed to escape, find a boat, and come out to meet the sub. But no one came. Aerial reconnaissance later confirmed that both battleships had been damaged. When Italy changed sides in 1943, the 6 men emerged from British prisoner-of-war camps. They had entered the harbour at about the same time as some British destroyers, had suffered some slight shocks but no serious effects from a small explosive charge set that was dropped in the water as a routine defence measure, and then proceeded onwards. Marsiglia reported that everything had gone exactly to plan. They had found the battleship Queen Elizabeth and fastened the charge by means of a line slung between the bilge keels on either side of the hull. Whilst these efforts were successful, he was very tired and beginning to get quite cold. They saw men on the deck of the battleship, but were not themselves seen, and so they went ashore, ditching the pig and their diving gear. Pretending to be French sailors, since there was part of the French fleet interned at Alexandria, they got as far as Rosetta when the Egyptian police were not fooled. Martellotta's target had been a tanker, but the first ship he found was a cruiser. Reluctantly, he obeyed orders and left her, found the tanker, set his charge, and released the incendiaries supposed to ignite the oil in due course. Cold and breathing pure oxygen was having an effect. He had a headache, his lips could no longer keep the mouthpiece in, and he had to vomit, so he surfaced. The incendiaries were distributed, and then they went ashore, but this time they didn't get past the Egyptian control post. They were still being interrogated when, one after another, they heard 3 explosions in the harbour. Della Pen reported that things had gone a little bit wrong from the start for his part, when his thin diving suit had been torn. When you go into the sea without a fully protective suit, you begin to die. It may first seem bracing or invigorating, but in fact it's the beginning of medical death through cold. The warmth flows out of your body into the water. This can result in courageous men becoming cowardly, energetic men becoming lethargic, and the will to live slackening off. Judge, then, what Della Pen did in these circumstances. Sighting a large mass, which was the Valiant, he went through the net barrier on the surface because he recognised the onset of cold and he knew what the effects would be. He touched the hull for a moment, and then the pig went out of control towards the bottom 17 metres below. Della Pen dived after it and found that his companion, Bianchi, was missing. The pig had landed some distance away, and so he tried to start the motor so as to drive it back to the Valiant. But the motor would not start. He investigated and found that a steel wire had fouled the propeller. The 22-foot-long pig could now be moved nearer only if he dragged it physically through the water. But which way? He tried using his compass, but that was useless in the presence of such a large mass of ferrous metal. Physical effort was causing his mask to fog up, and his frantic movements were raising dense masses of upwelling muck from the bottom, so that he was lost inside a dark cloud of his own making. At any moment he expected the British to become aware of what was happening, drop explosive charges, and ruin the operation. Panting, sweating, he dragged at the stubborn and awkward pig, guided now in his direction not by vision, but by the sound of a pump inside the battleship. After 40 minutes of extreme exertion, underwater and in the dark, he bumped against the steel hull. He set the time fuses and surfaced, wrenched off his mask and breathed pure air instead of compressed oxygen. Someone called out to him, a searchlight came on, and a machine gun opened up. He swam back to the battleship's mooring buoy and found there, clinging to it, his missing companion, Bianchi, who had fainted underwater but had made the surface and hidden by the buoy to avoid giving the alarm. The Valiant could of course be saved simply by moving her, because the charge was lying under the hull and not slung from it as had been intended and as had been accomplished on Queen Elizabeth. While waiting to be picked up, the two Italians could clearly hear the British talking, assuming that the operation had been bungled by two panic-stricken Italians. But they were wrong. Della Pen told Bianchi they might soon change their minds about Italians. A British motorboat took them ashore for interrogation, where a British officer, making wild gestures with a revolver, told them in best Germanic style that he would soon find ways of making them talk, a clear indication that he was actually averse to violence. The threat proving unsuccessful, another method was tried. The two Italians were taken aboard the battleship and brought before her commanding officer, Captain Morgan. He asked where the charge was, and when they did not reply, he sent them below to a place very near where the charge would presently go off. Their armed escort offered rum and cigarettes and kindness, but that didn't work either. However, from the name on their cap bands, the Italians could see that they were in the bowels of the Valiant, their target. When his watch told him that it was almost time, Della Pen asked to speak to the captain, and on being escorted on deck, told him that nothing could stop an imminent explosion, but that he could still get his men to safety. Morgan again asked where the charge was, and as Della Pen was silent, he had him sent down below again. The explosion then occurred, putting out the lights and visibly shaking the hull. Then the ship began to list to port. Della Pen managed to get back on deck again in time to see the results of the explosion underneath Queen Elizabeth. Neither of the battleships actually sank. The harbour was too shallow for that. They simply settled slightly on the bottom with their waterlines riding unnaturally high. But, effectively, they were out of the war for now. In the same month, under the bombs and torpedoes of the Japanese Naval Air Arm, the Prince of Wales and Repulse went to their death under Tom Phillips. In Africa, the Germans beat the British army and almost drove it back to the gates of Cairo. Malta seemed to be on its last gasp. At this nadir of the war for Britain, the Italian fleet had total superiority in capital ships, and, with the Germans, might have invaded and taken Malta with incalculable consequences had they realised what they'd accomplished. But Malta would hold, barely supplied, and must have made an invasion at best seem very costly, and possibly even a humiliating failure for the Axis planners. Nonetheless, gold medals, Italy's highest award, were announced for the attackers who were now obviously behind barbed wire. But when it came to the presentation for Luigi della Pen, which was made in 1945 by the Crown Prince of Italy, one of the spectators stepped forward to present the medal instead. He was the now Admiral Sir Charles Morgan, formerly captain of the Valiant, and an old acquaintance, under some very different circumstances, to Luigi della Pen.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.